Let me tell you about a number that stopped me cold when I first read it. Over $1 billion in value, gone from one Canadian company in a matter of days. Not because of some overseas scandal, not because somebody ran off with the cash in the middle of the night, but because ordinary Canadians, people just like your neighbors, people just like the folks you'd nod to at the grocery store, quietly stopped being able to pay back their loans. And I want to walk you through this today, slowly and carefully, because I think it tells you something important about where things are heading in this country, especially if you're retired or getting close to it, and you're sitting there watching your dollar not stretch the way it used to, watching the same cart of groceries cost you $15, $20 more than it did last year. If that's you, then this story is your story too, even if you've never borrowed a nickel from these people in your life. My name's Michael Rutherford. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where we sit down and talk plainly about money in Canada. Not the American rules you see plastered all over YouTube, not the British ones either. Canadian rules, Canadian numbers for Canadians. Because I'll tell you, one of the most frustrating things in the world is watching a slick video full of advice that has absolutely nothing to do with how things actually work here. So let's do this properly. Let's get into it. The company at the center of all this is called goeasy. You might not know the name off the top of your head, but you'll almost certainly know the brands underneath it. There's Easy Financial, which hands out high-interest personal loans to people the banks turned away. There's Easy Home, which does lease-to-own furniture and electronics, the kind of arrangement where you end up paying 2 or 3 times what the sofa was worth. And then there's a company they bought back in 2021 called LendCare, which finances cars and what the industry cheerfully calls power sports. Things like ATVs, snowmobiles, boats, jet skis. They paid $320 million for LendCare. Now, on paper, back in 2021, that wasn't a crazy idea. Interest rates were on the floor. Money was cheap to borrow. And that gave a lender like this a lot of room to make a healthy profit. Let me explain how that profit actually works, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. These are what we call subprime lenders. Subprime just means high-interest lending to borrowers who, for one reason or another, don't qualify at a regular bank. Maybe they've got a bruised credit score. Maybe their history is spotty. So instead of walking into a bank and getting a loan at, say, 7%, they get pushed toward a lender who'll say yes, but at a far steeper price, 20%, 25%, all the way up to around 35% here in Canada. And here's the engine of the whole thing. The subprime lender borrows money cheaply at something like 6 or 7%, and then lends that very same money back out at 35%. That gap in the middle is called the spread, and it's where the money is made. Now, the lender knows perfectly well that some of those borrowers will never pay it all back. But that's baked into the plan. As long as the spread is fat enough, and as long as most of those borrowers are working and making their payments, the lender comes out ahead even with the losses. But you can already sense the weakness in that, can't you? What happens when people stop making those payments? When folks lose hours or lose jobs, and a bigger and bigger slice of those loans simply goes bad all at once. That's precisely what happened. Here's what came out. LendCare had been recording customer payments as though the money had already arrived, when in truth, some of it was still in the process of settling at the end of the month. And some of it, it turned out, never came in at all. It masked just how many borrowers were actually falling behind. In plain terms, they were counting money they hadn't collected yet. When the real picture finally came into the light, goeasy had to write off staggering amounts. In a single quarter, the losses on loans they no longer expect to ever collect came to roughly $331 million. Their charge-off rate, which is the industry's tidy little term for money that is simply gone, jumped to nearly 24%, up from about 9% the year before. And on the car and power sports side of LendCare, it was worse still. Over 40% of that portfolio going bad. $4 in 10 never coming home. The stock fell more than 70%. A company that had been worth well over $1.5 billion watched more than $1 billion in value evaporate. They suspended their dividend, the payment they'd been making to shareholders for years. They cut staff. They brought in new leadership and scrambled to renegotiate with their own lenders. It was, by any measure, a rout. Now, I can hear some of you already. Michael, I've never set foot in one of those payday shops in my life. Why on earth should I care what happens to them? Here's why. And this is the whole point, so stay with me. goeasy is a public company. It's traded on the stock exchange, which means by law it has to open its books and show you the cracks, whether it wants to or not. But that very same financial stress, that same rot, is almost certainly sitting quietly on the books of other lenders who don't have to tell you a single thing. The ones who aren't public. The ones who never send out a press release. goeasy isn't necessarily the sick patient. It might just be the only one forced to show its temperature. And more to the point than any of that, this stress is showing up right now in the wallets of millions of ordinary Canadians. People who are funding their day-to-day lives not with income, but by slowly growing their debt. Kicking the can down the road, month after month. Let me show you what I mean, because there's real data behind this. Every year, a firm of licensed insolvency trustees called Hoyes Michaelos puts out a detailed study on Canadian bankruptcy and insolvency. And insolvency, just so we're all on the same page, is the state you're in when you simply cannot pay your debts anymore. Not even the minimum payments. It's the wall at the end of the road. Now, the headline number from the latest study sounds almost calm. Consumer insolvencies rose by less than 2% nationally last year. You'd read that and think, well, that's hardly a catastrophe. But look behind the curtain, and it's a very different story. The average person filing insolvency in 2025 owed $67,496 in unsecured debt. That is the highest level they've recorded since they began tracking 15 years ago. And those debt loads jumped over 11% in a single year and nearly 37% over 3 years. Sit with what that actually tells you. People aren't hitting the wall sooner. They're holding on longer and longer, piling on more credit cards, more lines of credit, more payday loans, borrowing today just to cover what they borrowed yesterday. They're delaying the reckoning by digging deeper. And so, when they finally do hit that wall, the hole underneath them is far, far deeper than it used to be. As Doug Hoyes, the trustee behind the study, put it plainly, we're kicking the can down the road. And here's the part that I especially want those of us who are older to hear, because it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Seniors are now the fastest growing group in all of this. Canadians aged 60 and over now make up 12% of all insolvent debtors, up from 10% just 2 years earlier. That's a trend heading in the wrong direction. On average, a senior in this situation carries about $64,000 in unsecured debt, which is 22% more than the typical filer. And here's the one that really lands. Seniors hold the highest debt-to-income ratio of any age group in the country. Having carried debt right into retirement, they're now trying to juggle repayment against rising food, energy, and medical costs, all on a fixed income that doesn't budge no matter what the grocery store charges. I suspect that doesn't surprise many of you watching, In fact, I suspect some of you are living it. Now, if you live in this country, I probably don't need a fancy chart to convince you of any of this. You've watched the price of groceries climb week after week. You've watched your CPP and your OAS cover less than they did just a few years back. And if you're doing all right yourself, if you made careful choices and you're comfortable, you've still likely looked around and wondered how on earth some people are keeping up at all. You've done the arithmetic in your head, the wages, the prices, the rent, and it just doesn't add up. The honest answer is, in a great many cases, it isn't adding up. People are papering over the gap with borrowed money. They're masking the fact that they simply cannot keep pace with the cost of living, and they're doing it with debt. Now, I mentioned at the start that there are groups of Canadians being quietly worn down by all of this. Let me lay them out for you, because you may well be in one. The first is that enormous group of working Canadians who don't have built-up wealth to fall back on. No portfolio of stocks, no long-held real estate quietly climbing in value. When these folks need to borrow, they can't get the nice, boring 6 or 7% rate that a bank reserves for its safe customers. They get pushed toward the credit cards and the payday lenders charging 20, 30, 35%. They pay the highest price precisely because they can least afford it. That's the first group. But there's a second group, and this one connects straight to the housing market, and it's where things get particularly interesting. Roughly 3/4 of all Canadian household debt is tied up in real estate, and mostly in residential mortgages. Now, here's something that catches people off guard. Homeowners actually make up only a small slice of insolvency filings, though that slice has been quietly creeping up over the last couple of years. And you might ask, well, why so few? If everyone's stretched, why aren't more homeowners going under? The answer says everything about the Canadian character. Canadians will do almost anything to hold on to their home. You've heard the term house poor. Well, this is house poor in the flesh. What's actually happening is that struggling homeowners are taking on more and more unsecured, high-interest consumer debt, credit cards and payday loans, just to cover their groceries and their hydro bill, so that they can keep making that sacred mortgage payment every single month. The mortgage gets paid first, always, even if it means everything else gets borrowed. The numbers bear this out. The average insolvent homeowner owes nearly $112,000 in unsecured debt sitting on top of their mortgage. That's the pressure valve. That mountain of credit card debt is what let them keep the house right up until the moment they couldn't. It's the very same trap as the first group, just wearing a nicer coat and living in a nicer neighborhood. Now, some folks look at all this and predict a great housing crash. And truthfully, I'm skeptical of the apocalyptic version of that story. Not because the stress isn't real, but because of a pattern I've watched play out again and again. Whenever mortgage holders have faced genuine stress in this country, the government and the banks have stepped in to cushion the blow. Back in 2020, they mandated mortgage deferrals so people could pause their payments. When interest rates spiked a couple of years later, the banks quietly stretched people's amortizations out past 35 years to shrink the monthly payment. At one point, one of the big banks had over 1/5 of its entire mortgage book stretched out that long. And here's the quiet truth buried inside that. The bank doesn't actually want your house. Foreclosing is expensive, it's slow, and it's a public relations headache. They would far, far rather stretch your loan out over more years, keep you making payments, and collect more interest over the longer life of the loan. So you, the stressed homeowner, survive by the skin of your teeth, and the bank makes more money doing it. Everybody limps forward, and round it goes. Which brings me to the final piece. And honestly, it's the piece I find most striking of the whole story. This is the part that ties the payday shop and the gleaming bank tower together with a single thread. Where do you suppose a company like goeasy gets the money it turns around and lends out at 30+%? It doesn't print it, it borrows it. And a great deal of it traces right back to Canada's big banks. goeasy funds itself through large credit facilities and securitization arrangements. And the names backing those arrangements are the biggest, most respectable banks in the country. Now here's the elegant little trick. Those big banks are heavily regulated. They are not permitted to hand a 35% loan to somebody who plainly can't afford it. The rules forbid it. So what do they do instead? They lend the money to the subprime lender at a modest markup, and they let that lender go and do all the predatory work. The bank collects its tidy, respectable margin. It keeps its hands clean. It stays at a comfortable arm's length from the borrower who's actually drowning in 35% interest. The bank's name never appears on the loan agreement that's crushing that family. And when you look at it that way, you really do start to wonder how much daylight there is between the respectable bank and the payday shop down the street. Squint a little, and it can start to look like the very same money, simply wearing different hats depending on which room it's standing in. So let me leave you with what you can actually do about all of this, because I never, ever want to just hand you a bucket of doom and walk away. If you're already carrying heavy, high-interest debt, I want you to know you have real options, and one of them is genuinely underused. In Canada, there's a tool called a consumer proposal. It is not bankruptcy. It's a formal, legal arrangement where you negotiate to repay a portion of what you owe. Your creditors vote on whether to accept it, and if they do, the collection calls stop, and you repay that reduced amount over time. It stays on your credit file for about 3 years after you complete it, which is considerably gentler than a bankruptcy. And a licensed insolvency trustee will, by law, sit down with you for a first consultation at no cost. So if you're spending more than you bring in and quietly filling that gap with credit month after month, please look into it before the hole gets any deeper. There is no shame in it. It's a tool, and it exists for exactly this. And for everyone else, those of you not in a dire spot, my advice is the plain, unglamorous kind that actually works. Focus on your biggest expenses, not your morning coffee. I get so tired of hearing people blame the little things. If your housing and your vehicle together are eating more than half of what you bring home, then trimming a restaurant meal here and there simply will not fix that math. The real moves are the big, uncomfortable ones: downsizing, rethinking a car payment that's too large. Those are the levers that matter. And if you use a credit card, treat it as a genuine last resort and pay it off in full every single time. Because the entire business model we've talked about today depends on one single belief living rent-free in your head. The belief that your borrowing is just temporary, that you'll clear it soon. For most people, it isn't a bridge to somewhere better, it's a shovel, and it only digs one direction. The system we've walked through today isn't going anywhere. The facilities, the spreads, the quiet arrangements between the big banks and the lenders down the street, it's all going to carry right on. But now that you can see how it's built, plainly, in the daylight, it becomes a great deal harder for it to catch you off guard. And that, at the end of the day, is the whole point of what we do here. I'd truly love to hear from you on this one. Does any of it match what you're seeing in your own life, in your own family? Tell me down in the comments. I read them and I learn a great deal from you. And if this was helpful to you, do consider subscribing, because plain-spoken Canadian money talk with real Canadian numbers is exactly what we do on this channel. Take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.